And the next one is in the next aspect is an opposition, or at least you could say the next most powerful aspect is the opposition. And you can imagine, if it was the sun and moon, for example, you could imagine them starting with the conjunction, then the moon separates from the sun and it goes to the opposite position, and that would be the full moon. And it's when the sun and the moon are opposition. But all planets can be in opposition to each other. And the opposition shows separation. So whatever planets they are, they're going to show some kind of separation. For example, if you have, let's say, Mars and Venus in opposite to each other, and that's the feminine and the masculine planets, you're quite likely to be attracted to someone who you have to travel to see a lot, or they may be a long way away initially in the relationship, you could say. And then when you get together, you would tend to have some opposed kind of viewpoints about certain values, which would be Venus, or sexual matters, which would be Mars. And it would all contribute to kind of an exciting relationship, but one where there would be a lot of sparks. So another thing about the opposition, which is really important, is the kind of idea of projection. In other words, you have a tendency to identify with one planet and project the other planet. It's somebody else. So there's always the sense of reacting or relating to somebody who's imposing something on you. So you're in opposition to it. So you have to learn about relationships with oppositions. You have to learn about diplomacy, because generally there's this projection idea that somebody's doing something to you. I mean, I have the Sun in opposition to Jupiter, and Jupiter is kind of intellectual authorities. So I often find myself in opposition to certain intellectual authorities, and that's a projection mechanism that I have. And you can see, for example, with Marilyn Monroe's horoscope, she has an opposition here between Neptune, which is in her Leo in the first house, and the moon in Aquarius, and Jupiter. So Neptune's about 4 degrees, an orb of 4 degrees from Jupiter, and an orb of 3 degrees from moon, and it kind of brings moon and Jupiter together in a sense. So that's going to be an extremely powerful influence, and I'll talk about that later on. So that's the opposition. It's a pretty powerful aspect, and generally you'd sort of talk about the opposition having an orb of about 8 degrees. In other words, if two planets were 9 degrees away, well, it's still an opposition, but you might not be noticing it so much. But if the opposition was within 1 degree or 2 degrees, then this would be an incredibly dominating influence in your life, and very much characterized by this sense of being up against or in opposition to somebody or something, and a projection mechanism which you have to learn to integrate and understand in your life. The next difficult aspect, or the aspect, is the square. Now, I just want to say something about the opposition and the square. As I said, the conjunction is a merging of energy, and as such, it sort of can be good, it can be bad. It depends really on whether the planets like each other. You can sort of say, for example, well, Saturn is never easy to deal with, and if you have the Sun and Saturn in conjunction, that would create difficulties. But like Venus is a nice planet, it's always giving good things, and Jupiter's also considered a benefic, or has a good influence. So Venus and Jupiter together would generally be rather a nice conjunction. So conjunctions can be feel good, and they can also feel rather difficult. But when we get to the opposition and the square, these influences are really difficult to integrate. And there's no use sort of saying, well, it's good to have a square or an opposition because you learn. Yeah, you do, and that is a good thing. But the actual feeling inside your own psychology, inside your own nature of having an opposition, and especially having a square, is really quite frustrating and irritating, and creates a lot of tension. So traditionally, oppositions and squares have been considered bad aspects, And bad aspects are kind of based really on the division of the circle into 4. You can actually get a half square, semi-square, and a sesqui-square, the midpoints of these, the square, and they're also considered tense. So the opposition and the square it shows difficulty in integrating energies, and it shows 2 very, very different energies, which basically are working against each other, and that creates an inner sense of discomfort and tension, and you can be really specific about this in the horoscope. You can see, for example, Marilyn Monroe. She's got both an opposition from Moon Jupiter to Neptune, but Saturn is square Neptune. That Saturn is square Neptune, and it's also square the Moon, and those squares will undoubtedly, and did undoubtedly, create really serious emotional issues in her life. So what do you do when you've got a square? Well, it's part of life. It's part of your karmic baggage. You have to learn to resolve the conflicting interests that the planets in square to each other represent. Because generally speaking, if in a square, one planet will say be in fire, and the other will be in water or in earth, and they don't really harmonize with each other. Whereas with the harmonic aspects, which we're coming to in a bit, they tend to be from harmonious positions, like this water signs, from one water sign to another, or from water to earth, which kind of is a little easier to handle. But squares are always from these elements that don't really harmonize with each other. So you're really juggling difficult issues with a square.